All right, thanks, Greg. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today I've been asked to talk about anthrax, and I guess the reason for that is that we've had 4 cases in the last 18 months in southern Queensland, and it's an unusual event, and an event we hope we don't see too often. But because of that, we've had a fair bit of experience with anthrax recently, and I'd just like to share some of those experiences. So today I'm going to talk specifically about the disease, and the first thing I'm going to talk about is the causative organism. So anthrax is a bacteria, not a virus, and it's interesting in several ways. First of all, it has a 2-stage life cycle. It has a living stage where it's what we call the vegetative stage, where it grows, and it grows in specific conditions. It doesn't like oxygen, so it likes partial oxygen conditions, and it likes plenty of growth medium for nutrition. And during that stage, while it's growing, it produces some toxins. Now, it also has a second stage, which is the spore stage, and this is the stage that it retreats into when things are unfavorable for its growth. And the problem with anthrax is that the spore stage is extremely resistant and can last for decades or even several hundred years in the soil or in the organic material where it's reasonably protected. And it's highly resistant, which means it's not easily destroyed by chemical means, or even with exposure to sunlight, it takes quite a while to destroy it. So now the story is that we think that anthrax has developed these mechanisms to protect itself while it's growing in the soil. So there are other predators, soil-borne predators, things like amoebas, that normally feed on bacteria. So anthrax has developed a couple of protective mechanisms. First of all, it's developed a capsule which surrounds the actual bacteria itself, and then it also secretes 3 different types of toxins. And these protective mechanisms that allow it to grow in the soil also allow it to grow within animals. And although the defense mechanisms were originally developed for other protozoans, in fact, it actually then has a major impact on the animals that it grows in. So the 3 types of toxins that this anthrax produces is, first of all, a toxin that causes the blood not to clot, so it stops the blood clotting mechanisms. It also has a toxin that actually reduces the immune system of the host, and the third one causes damage to the blood vessels, which allows the serum to escape through the blood vessels into the tissues, and so you get edema, and eventually you get toxic shock, and it's the toxins that actually kill the animals. Okay, so here we can see on the top right-hand part of the screen, anthrax bacteria under a microscope, and you can see the characteristic chains. And if you look carefully, you can see there's a darker area in the center of each of these little bacteria, rod-shaped bacteria, and that's the spore that's sitting within the bacteria. So when it's exposed to unfavorable conditions, the vegetative stage stops growing and disintegrates, and the spore's left there until the conditions are favorable for growth again. Okay, on the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a scanning electron microscope view of these bacteria. And in there, you can see a single red cell, and also those little fuzzy-looking things are white cells or phagocytes, and their role is normally to engulf these bacteria and destroy them. But because of the protective mechanisms, that doesn't happen, and so the immune system is not able to get rid of the infection in most animals. Okay. So now let's look at the history. In Australia, in Queensland, it's listed as restricted matter under the Biosecurity Act 2014, and that's because it causes significant disease, or potentially causes significant disease in livestock. It's also, and as a result of that, you need to, if any cases that are detected, need to be notified to DAF, to the Chief Veterinary Officer, as part of the requirements under that Biosecurity Act. Now, it's also a zoonotic disease, which means it affects humans. And so under Queensland health legislation, it's a notifiable disease there as well. Okay, where do we find it? Now, it first occurred in New South Wales in 1847. And we believe that it came to Australia in probably contaminated bedding on livestock ships as they brought livestock from England and to a less extent Europe to Australia. And then probably a series of animals would die and then contaminate the bedding, and then the new animals would pick up the disease and then continue to become infected until they got to Australia and then brought the disease with them. Now, throughout the 19th century, the disease spread widely through northern Victoria and central New South Wales, and was a major impact on the livestock industry. There was a very large mortality rate in those animals. So it spread up through what we call the Anthrax Belt, which is the central part of New South Wales, and it extends into northern Victoria and to southern Queensland. And the reason it prefers that area is because it's got specific growth requirements in the soil. It likes to have slightly alkaline soils, and it likes soils that are rich in calcium with a lot of organic material. We don't see it on the coast because primarily on the coast there's a lot of acid sulfate soils which are unfavourable for its growth. It also requires periodic inundation and a rainfall of between 200 and 500 millimetres per year. So we don't see it on the coast because it's too wet and it's too acid. We don't see it in the west, in the desert country, because it's too dry for the bacteria to grow and proliferate in the soil. Okay, so we thought, yep, it's a major disease of New South Wales, which was eventually combated through the middle of last century by the introduction of vaccines, which controlled the disease. And in Queensland, we've been fairly lucky. We've had only one case in the 20th century, and then this century, where there was one case at Ingi in southern Queensland in 2002. So that was the last case that we knew of up until about 18 months ago. So this is the anthrax belt, as you can see, and it's traditionally an area that was infected with anthrax and caused mortality. So what some researchers, led by a fellow called Barro, did is they looked at all the previous cases of anthrax throughout New South Wales, and they identified all the physical characteristics associated with those sites, and that was things like soil type, rainfall, temperature variations, inundation, acidity, alkalinity. And they took all those and they put it into a model, developed a model, and they came up with a predicted distribution chart. So this is where anthrax potentially could exist and grow, but it doesn't necessarily mean that anthrax is exactly throughout all of that. So to get anthrax, you still need to seed the country with an infected animal that dies and then spreads the spores. But this map shows us now where anthrax could exist if it was brought there with an infected animal. Now, what species does it affect? Anthrax, because it's been around for a long time, different species have different susceptibilities to this particular disease. The most susceptible are herbivores. These are all your herbivores, including your ungulates, even-toed animals, but also horses, and you can see in this case a zebra. So these animals are particularly susceptible. They pick up the disease primarily by grazing and picking up the spores that are in the soil attached to the grass that they're eating, and then the bacteria get inside and start to grow. More resistant are the omnivores, and that's particularly pigs and humans. So both species are relatively resistant to anthrax, but certainly can be affected. And in the case of pigs, certainly can die from the disease, as can humans. And that's primarily through consumption in the case of pigs and through cutaneous infection in humans. More resistant are the carnivores, your dogs and your cats and your other wild predators, because they've evolved to feed on carcasses, and so they've evolved a stronger than normal resistance to anthrax toxins. How's it transmitted? Well, primarily in herbivores, it's contracted by ingesting the spores, the latent spores that are in the dirt attached to the grass. They're ingested, get into the gastrointestinal system where there is a low level of oxygen and plenty of nutrients, and this allows the spores to change back into their growing stage, the vegetative stage, and as they grow and multiply within the animal, they then produce these toxins, and once the level of bacteremia and toxemia gets to a certain level, you get clinical disease and then death in those animals. In carnivores and pigs, usually it's through the consumption of contaminated carcasses, and so feral pigs are particularly important for this because then they subsequently get infected and they can then die and become a new nidus of infection themselves. In humans, of course, humans are also susceptible to anthrax, and in overseas countries, many people still die from the consumption of anthrax-infected animals, where an animal gets sick or is about to die. In places like Africa and Eastern Europe, that animal might be slaughtered and then the meat divided up amongst people in the village, and then people may die from anthrax through the ingestion of partly cooked meat. It's also possible for people to get anthrax through inhaling anthrax-infected dust, but that's fairly rare. And so in Australia, the only cases of anthrax in humans we have is generally through contact with abraded skin, cutaneous anthrax. And that used to be called wool sorter's disease because in the old days, people used to, when wool was worth a pound, people would not leave a dead sheep just to disintegrate on the ground. They'd skin that animal and take the fleece because the wool was worth a fair bit of money. And in doing so, if that animal had died from anthrax, people became contaminated with the anthrax and they would develop cutaneous anthrax. And I'll talk a little bit about how that actually occurs in the next slide. Now, just back up a bit, we think that anthrax probably came to central New South Wales and southern Queensland through the movement of infected animals. As I mentioned, they came across from England and Europe in ships. Those animals would then probably moved into better pastures into central New South Wales. And then in those days, in the 19th and early 20th century, most of the movement of animals was by droving. And so these animals would have been moved up stock routes to new pastures. And if you had a flock of, say, 3,000 odd sheep and 20 or 30 of them died, then generally they were just left on the side of the stock route and not buried or burnt or anything like that. And so these animals, if they died from anthrax, would then present a new nidus of infection. And so we believe that that's how these animals were scattered throughout the area that's known as the anthrax belt. And so even though that map shows where anthrax is able to grow, unless you had a infected animal die, then you wouldn't have a source of the spores. But unfortunately, we don't know where that is, and so anywhere in that area potentially could have been infected with anthrax. Okay, so talking about the clinical disease now. The incubation period is generally 4 to 7 days. That is from the time the animal is exposed to the disease to the time it develops clinical signs, but it can be longer, and I saw one animal that was 10 days from exposure to the time it died, but generally in that period for the incubation period. In herbivores, you generally don't get too many clinically ill animals. You normally find that it's the per-acute disease, which means that the animals die very quickly and usually without being seen. So normally the presenting sign is you go out and you find a dead animal or several dead animals. Okay. Occasionally you will get you'll get an acute case where you'll find animals that are showing clinical signs. And in that case, you get animals, generally they're staggering. They'll have an extremely high temperature, 39 to 40 degrees centigrade. They'll have trouble breathing with dyspnea, and then they'll go down, they'll start to convulse, and then they'll die very quickly. Animals generally die within a couple of hours, and the ones that I've seen have died within 10 or 15 minutes from the time they start to show clinical signs. Now, in pigs, the disease is usually a bit more chronic, and the most thing you see in pigs is usually you get enlargement of the head and neck because of the edema of the throat and lymph nodes in the head and neck. And these animals often will die, but they often take longer to die, anything up to 5 to 7 days. And in some cases, they will actually recover from the disease. So that's the disease clinical signs. Okay, so as we mentioned, you rarely see clinically affected animals, and if you do, they generally die fairly quickly. But on post-mortem, which is what you're likely to see, it's usually you find sudden death with no evidence of struggling. So these animals don't have extended periods of illness on the ground. They die very rapidly, and so there's generally not much paddling, and you'll just find them dead. Usually there's no rigor mortis because of the lack of a lack of the blood clotting mechanisms. And as a result of that, when they die, the blood comes out through all the orifices, and it's often a dark, tarry looking blood, but it doesn't clot. So it runs out through the eyes, the nose, the ears, the vulva, the anus, and it forms a pool around the body of the animal. If you have a look at the urine, it may be blood stained as well. And the other thing that we've noticed is that these animals are usually found near water. And in my opinion, I think it's because when they have a high fever, they get thirsty, and so they head to the water, and then they die very rapidly, and so therefore die around the water. Now, because anthrax is a dangerous organism to humans, it's a zoonotic disease, and because on exposure to air, the vegetative forms rapidly turn into the resistant spore form, we don't do postmortems on these animals. It's dangerous, and it increases the level of infection. If the animal is left intact, unopened, then the putrefaction process of the animal raises the acidity in the animal and increases the temperature, and that rapidly kills the vegetative form before it turns into the spore form. But if it's opened up either by a postmortem or by feral pigs, the air that gets onto the into the animal rapidly causes a lot of these bacteria then to change into spore form, and you've got much more contamination. So the rule of thumb is don't conduct a postmortem if you suspect anthrax. So this is basically the sort of presentation that we found on the initial property. The initial property was located in southwestern Queensland, close to the border, and as I've mentioned, it's a mixture of sort of heavy black cracking clays, black and brown cracking clays, and lighter sandy country. And in this country, the producer had good feed in a couple of paddocks, and he had been suffering from sporadic mortalities throughout his herd, but overlying that was the ongoing problem we had with pimalia in the district. So pimalia was causing toxicity in a lot of cattle and caused sporadic mortalities. And so throughout this area, a lot of the producers were seeing this sporadic mortality, and it's probably masked the initial stages of this particular outbreak. Anyway, the producer went out one day, and he, instead of a couple of dead animals, he found 90 dead animals. And as you can see from this photo, they were scattered all over. They were all cows in very good condition, prime fat cows with calves, and 90 dead. And walking around the paddock, you could just see dead animals lying all over the place. So obviously he called his private veterinarian and investigated. So now this is the area that we're talking about. This is the bottom of the picture shows pretty much the Queensland-New South Wales border. And as you can see, the towns illustrated there are St George, Bolen and Dirranbandi. And you can see the Bolen and Kalgoa rivers run through from St George just to the west of Dirranbandi and down through into that country. So this country is a mixture of that black cracking soils and lighter red country. And it does have the periodic inundation, and it's alkaline soil. So we now know that this is quite suitable country for anthrax to persist and grow in the soil. And in fact, all 4 cases have occurred in this area. Okay. So as I mentioned before, we think that the contamination probably came originally in the 19th and 20th century through the movement of probably sheep. This used to be all sheep country, from New South Wales across the border into this area, and those animals that were dying from anthrax have then seeded the country with anthrax spores. So this is further, you can see there was reasonably good feed in these paddocks. There's pimalia throughout that country, and these dead animals are often found close to water troughs or melon holes full of water. So as you can see, one of the signs is rapid bloating, lack of rigor mortis, and discharges from all the orifices of these animals. This shows another photo of the typical black soil country, which is also called melon hole country or gilgai. And this is quite undulating, and you can see the depressions in the ground. And these depressions in the ground hold water, and as a result, the grass grows there. But in the event of rain, we believe that this may uncover some of the spores and wash them into the bottom of the gilgai where they mix with the soil that the new growth is growing in, and these animals preferentially feed into the gilgai, and so they're exposed to these spores. We believe on this property that probably there was a few initial cases, and then because they were undiagnosed by the producer, that other animals became exposed, and that led to the very significant outbreak of disease over a fairly short period of time. And in the end, he lost about 120 cattle over about a week and a half in these two paddocks. So here you can see another aerial view of an animal, and you can see the characteristic halo of bloody fluids that have oozed out of that animal, and that's all heavily contaminated with bacterial spores. Okay, this is a close-up of some very recently dead animals, and you can see these animals have just died, and as a result of the lack of blood clotting mechanisms due to the toxins, blood's coming out of the nose, the eyes, and the vulva, and that's all this material is heavily contaminated with anthrax spores. Okay, diagnosis. How do we diagnose it? Well, probably the most important thing is your case history, and it's critical to rule out other causes so that you are able to be aware of potential cases of anthrax. And things like case history are really important, because if you've got sudden mortality due to things like clostridial diseases, such as blackleg or tetanus or enterotoxemia, they can present very similarly with rapid sudden mortality. You don't tend to get the bloody discharges, but it's certainly something that you want to try and rule out. And if you're vaccinating, you can usually rule those out of your differential diagnosis. So here I'll put in a plug for private practitioners. Private practitioners are the best asset that a producer can have in the case of a mortality event, because your practitioner is the person who has the skills to be able to sort through the evidence and to make a list of differential diagnoses, of which anthrax may or may not be one of the differential diagnoses. So again, the presentation of the case we know is now rapid death, bloated carcasses, rapid decomposition, and bloody discharge from the orifices. How do we confirm a suspicion of anthrax? Well, we do that through the laboratory, and the primary sample that we need are thin blood smears made from the dead animal, and that can either be blood that's obtained through a blood vessel, or alternately from the bloody discharges coming out of the orifices. Those blood smears are then stained, and they're looked at under a microscope to look for the characteristic bacteria, and I'll show you a photo of those in a minute. There's a couple of other tests we can do. The gold standard test used to be culture, but that can take a while, and that's to actually try and grow the organisms in specific media to see if they grow up and then can be identified as anthrax. But more recently, we use serology for it, and now Queensland Health have got a PCR or a molecular technique which is able to rapidly diagnose the bacteria. And finally, we have now what we call pen-side tests or lateral flow devices. These are a little cartridge that you can take a drop of blood from the animal, mix it with some diluent, put it into a little well, and then within 15 minutes you can get a reasonably reliable diagnosis of whether or not it's anthrax. And I'll show you some of those in a minute. So here I just want to make a plug again. The most important way of diagnosing this is to have your private veterinarian. Now this is Dr. Libby Egan. Libby was actually the private veterinarian who diagnosed all 4 of our recent outbreaks. She was very diligent and suspected anthrax when she was first called out, took the correct samples without doing a post-mortem as she suspected anthrax, and as a result of that we had a rapid diagnosis of anthrax. And on the right there you can see the specimens that are used, and that is a thin blood smear on the left, and then it's stained with polychrome methylene blue stain on the right and looked at under a microscope. So that's probably our main method of diagnosis. And then we have Okay, so here on the left, on the top left, we have a microscopic view of stained anthrax organisms, and you can see they're in a chain, and within the center of each of those rod-shaped rectangular bacteria, which are joined end to end, you can see the resistant spores in the center of those. And when, as I mentioned, they're exposed to air, the rest of the bacteria dies, but those spores remain until conditions improve for growth again. Now, on the top right-hand side, we can see what we call an anthrax ICT kit, or immunochromographic test. And this is also called a lateral flow device. What we do is we take a drop of blood from the animal, mix it with a diluent, and fill that little well on the right-hand side, which is S for sample. We wait about 15 minutes, and as that fluid migrates through the other wells, they're exposed to a media which has got antibodies, and attached to those antibodies is an indicator dye. And so if antigen or the bacterial proteins from the bacteria activate those antibodies, you then get a line developing. So in this case, this is a negative result. We've got a line in the control well which says that the test is valid, but there's no line in the test cell, which means that we haven't picked up any antigens or proteins from the anthrax bacteria. In contrast to that, we look at the bottom left-hand corner, and we've got a line in both the control, which means that the test is valid, and in the test well, which means that we've got positive detection of anthrax proteins in that test. So in this case, the specificity is very high, which means that we're sure that this is anthrax. But unfortunately, because the sensitivity is quite low, if you get a negative result, it doesn't mean that it's not anthrax. So this is an aid to diagnosis, but only an aid. And so therefore it's important to have your private veterinarian do a full history and assessment. On the bottom right-hand corner, we can see a technician looking at a bacterial growth plate, an agar plate with some bacterial colonies on it. And that's the other technique that we use for anthrax, is to grow it on suitable media. And as you can see, he's protecting himself through these sort of correct protective clothing, and he's working within a biohazard hood, which sucks the air out from where he is through filters. All right, well, I'm going to talk a bit about the zoonotic aspect of anthrax now. So in humans, as I mentioned, the only cases of anthrax we've had in Australia is cutaneous anthrax, where there's been an infection through the skin. And you need to have direct contact with contaminated material, and you need a braided skin or a wound to allow the bacteria to get into the skin. So it used to be called a malignant carbuncle, and it starts off with a small red lump in the area, usually associated with the scratch or cut or wherever the infection came in. And then within a very short period of time, it starts to form into a blister. Now, those blisters spread, it gets bigger and bigger. And the center, after 2 to 6 days, the center of the blister becomes necrotic, which means it dies. And that's because the tissue's been killed by the toxins. And it forms what we call an eschar, which is a hard, black, dead piece of skin in the center of a ring of blisters. And then that's surrounded outside that by a big ring of inflammation, because the body's immune system is trying to fight the bacteria, but the bacteria are gaining. As I mentioned there, it's usually quite painless, and that's because the toxins are actually destroying the nerves in the skin as it spreads. Now, it spreads through the lymphatic system. So like many of these things, like snake bite and all these things, the toxins spread through the lymphatic system. And so it will spread up the lymphatics into regional lymph nodes, and then eventually become systemic if it's not treated. And if it's not treated in humans, it certainly can become fatal, and people will have and will die from anthrax if they're not recognised, diagnosed and treated. So prevention obviously is the most important, and that is through awareness and to avoidance, basically to avoid having any direct contact with a potentially infected animal or potentially infected material. So now, infected animals, obviously we're talking about dead ones, because live animals aren't a risk at this stage. It's not until they die and then you get a sudden release of the bacteria and the toxins from the animal into the environment that it produces a infectious material. But other things like hay, equipment, even vehicles can be contaminated, and so that's how a human may become exposed to anthrax and develop a cutaneous infection. Luckily, we can treat anthrax. It's very susceptible to most of the common antibiotics, including penicillins and doxycycline, and with early detection and treatment, resolves completely. So I guess the take-home message there is, first of all, be aware of anthrax, make sure you don't have any contact with potentially infected material, and if you do develop a lesion that you're suspicious of, get to the doctor and have it examined very quickly, and if they suspect anthrax, they'll treat you with antibiotics, and that will take care of the problem. Okay, here we can see a couple of photos which sort of illustrate that. The top photos you can see on the finger and then on the top of the hand, you can see that the bacteria have caused the necrosis of the central part, forming that black eschar, and then around that is a ring of blistering, and then around that again is the redness from all the inflammation. So these will progress unless they're treated, and you can see the bottom left-hand photo is a fellow whose arm has been infected, and that infection is now spreading up the lymphatic system of his arm, and obviously in this case here will be treated, but if that was not treated, it potentially could become fatal. So now the other thing is, I guess everyone knows about the white letters, the white powder in the letters. Anthrax, because it is a significant zoonotic disease, some countries in the world have utilized this to make weapons out of, and what they call weaponize the bacteria. Normally the bacteria is quite heavy and they don't spread well in the air, so the research has made these spores much lighter and able to be dispersed through the air, and so it's now listed as a bioweapon or a weapon of mass destruction, and I guess the main risk is bioterrorism today. However, that's a special type of anthrax that needs to be developed in government laboratories or in terrorist laboratories, and it's not a risk from the anthrax that we find in animals in Australia. Okay. Right, so prevention. Now, prevention, the most important thing, of course, is awareness, being aware of where you are and where your stock are, trying to source your cattle from areas, or cattle or sheep from areas that may not have anthrax present. Doing things like holding your stock in a quarantine yard for the potential incubation period if you do suspect they may have come from an anthrax infected area. So if you bring in new stock, hold them for that 4 to 7 to 10 days in a little quarantine paddock, and if they survive past that time, then it's highly unlikely that they'll have been infected with anthrax. Same thing with sourcing your equipment and any feed. At the moment, we're suffering from a severe drought, so people are importing hay. Always be aware that hay is a potential source of infection for a range of diseases, whether it be botulism or anthrax. And same thing, just be aware, maybe if you start to feed it out, keep an eye on your herd or your flock initially to make sure that you're not going to have problems with introducing the bacteria. The best and most effective prevention method is to vaccinate your stock. Now, there's a vaccine produced by Virbac. It's a live vaccine, and it's registered in Australia for use in cattle and sheep, and it's injected subcutaneously, and the dose rate is 1 ml for cattle and 5 mL for, half a ml for sheep, and it comes in a 50 ml bottle. So that works out approximately about $5 a dose for cattle and about $2.50 a dose for sheep. Now, it's a highly effective vaccine. It's a live vaccine. What they've done is they've found a mutant of the bacteria that doesn't have a capsule, and the lack of capsule means that the bacteria is unable to cause severe disease in animals, but it still has a immunogenic or a stimulating response to the immune system in those animals. So basically, the vaccine is recommended to be given in 2 doses. 1 dose will last for about 6 to 12 months in your animals, and it takes about 5 to 7 days for that immunity to kick in. and then they recommend another vaccination 6 to 12 months after the first one, and that will give much better immunity. They believe that potentially that will give lifelong immunity in most animals, but the drug company does recommend annual vaccination, particularly on infected premises. So your vaccine is a highly effective way of protecting your stock, even in places where you know that you've had cases of anthrax. Now, the other thing, of course, is that once they're vaccinated, we need to still be mindful that animals that are appearing healthy could be incubating the disease, even though they've been vaccinated. And we know the incubation period is 4 to 7 days, or anything up to 10 days. So as a result, in Queensland, we require that producers who have vaccinated their animals hold their animals for 20 days post-vaccination before those animals are moved off the property or able to be sold. And that's simply to give it time so that if an animal is incubating, is vaccinated, but still succumbs to the disease, that they've not moved off that property before they succumb. So that's one thing. The second one is that the vaccine itself has a slaughter withholding period of 42 days, which means it can't be slaughtered for human consumption within that period. And that's something to know. They can be sold after 20 days, but not slaughtered for human consumption within that 42-day period. Now, the vaccine itself is quite fragile, and so you need to be aware, if you're using the vaccine, that it can't be exposed to extreme heat or to ultraviolet, to sunlight, because that will actually kill the living bacteria that's in the vaccine and render your vaccine useless. So one of the things we do in Queensland is that we require a newly infected premise to be vaccinated by a private veterinarian. So private veterinarians are the only people in Queensland who are able to order the vaccine, and to do that they have to apply to the Chief Veterinary Officer of Queensland to get written permission to order the vaccine. Once they've ordered the vaccine, we require that the veterinarian does the initial vaccination, and that is so that we can keep quality control. That is, ensure that the cold chain's been observed, that the vaccine's not been left to get too hot, make sure that the dose rate is correct, make sure that the site of injection is correct, and that the correct groups of animals and all the susceptible animals are vaccinated. Once that's happened, then we're happy for the producers to vaccinate their animals under the direction of the veterinarian. And on neighbouring properties, same thing applies. So they can apply to vaccinate their animals, but it needs to be under the supervision of a veterinarian, and the veterinarian is required to actually purchase the vaccine for the producer. Okay. Any questions on vaccine?
There are some questions. One of them was...
I thought I just stunned everybody to silence.
No. Can kangaroos get anthrax, and can they spread it?
Yes, kangaroos can get anthrax, but there's been so little work done on it, we just don't know how important they are, how often they do get infected, or how important they are in spreading the disease. There's just been no research done on it.
Okay, another quick question. If anthrax could survive the long trip out on a ship's transport, why has it not already spread to the areas that are suited to its growth?
Because it requires to be moved in an animal. So you need to have an animal that is incubating the disease to move to a new area and then to die in that new area for the disease to spread. The only other way is if you have contaminated bedding or contaminated feed, then it can spread that way. But of course, the amount of contamination on feed would be much less than that found in an animal that dies from the disease.
Okay, so then how does that go then with regard to vehicles, tyres and boots that you might be wearing?
Okay, well certainly any fomite is what we call these things, can transmit anthrax because it's in the soil, and of course if you've got vehicle tyres caked with mud or that's been contaminated by driving through one of these areas that are heavily contaminated, or boots, you certainly can transmit the disease that way. However, I guess the risk is lower than the movement of live animals because the very fact of driving on a bitumen road or even on a hot dirt road is going to throw off most of that mud, and most of that mud then will get hot and be exposed to to radiation, and so the level of infection is possible, but is low. And again, we say really it's the incubating animal that is the disease risk. This disease doesn't spread easily by other methods, but it is certainly possible to transmit it on those inanimate objects.
Okay, so if there is a possibility of transmission through those forms of inanimate objects, as in boots and tyres, what's the best way to decontaminate?
Okay, well, of course, the most important thing is to get rid of the organic material that is attached to it, and we're talking mud, blood, feces, and the best way to do that, of course, is to wash that off. So when we're moving vehicles or people off a infected premise, we ensure that all the vehicles are washed down, make sure all the mud and any of that organic material is removed. Same thing with boots, they're scrubbed down, and then you can apply a final decontamination. Now, because it's such a resistant organism, it's also hard to kill, and so some of the chemicals that we use for decontamination are things like formaldehyde, and of course they have their own inherent risks in that they're toxic, they're potentially carcinogenic, and they're certainly very irritant. So you have to be careful with that. There is a decontaminant called Virkon S, which is registered for use on anthrax in the United Kingdom, but not registered in Australia. So I mean, it would be effective, but it's not registered for that use here. But the primary thing is to make sure you get rid of all the mud and blood and other organic material, and then wash down with the detergent to try and remove any potential spores from those inanimate objects.
Okay, thank you for that. One quick question before we move on. If your property's not infected, do you still need a vet to administer the vaccine? Can the vaccine be used with goats? And is there a test for soil?
Okay. No, you don't need a veterinarian, but you need a veterinarian to supervise it. So they're the only people who can order the vaccine, and they need Chief Veterinary Officer approval to do it. So a producer can ring their local vet and say, look, I really want to preemptively vaccinate my stock because I'm worried. I haven't had any cases, but I'm worried that I don't want to get any. So contact your private veterinarian. They can order the vaccine, get a CVO approval, and then the producer can vaccinate their own stock under direction. And as I say, one of the reasons for that is you don't want to stick the needle in yourself. It's quite a nasty vaccine and causes a significant inflammatory response, and so you need to be careful using it, and you need to make sure you use the right dose rate and keep the cold chain, etc. So that's the first question. The second one was...
Can you use on goats?
Can you use it on goats? It certainly would be effective on goats. I just, off the top of my head, not sure if it's registered for using goats. I'd have to check that one up. Certainly registered for cattle and sheep. It would certainly be effective in goats. They would respond exactly the same as sheep, but I'd have to check and see if it's registered for using goats. And the third question?
Last question, is there a test for the soil?
Not directly. I have taken soil samples and sent them down to the reference laboratory in Victoria. There they try to culture the organisms. So you can do that, but we didn't have much luck with that. I would suggest that it's not a practical way of looking for anthrax, because you could move a couple of feet and have anthrax infected material and then move another couple of feet and not have any. So I think that's probably not an effective way of determining whether or not you've got anthrax on your property.
Okay. Now, there are a few more questions, but we might just hold them off until the end because, we can continue with the presentation.
Okay. So basically looking at control, and I've talked about some of this stuff already, the main one is movement restrictions. Because a live animal exposed to anthrax can incubate the disease for potentially up to 10 days, it's the movement of these live animals off a infected property that poses the risk to other properties. And so as a result, we have a policy in Queensland where animals are not allowed to move for 20 days post-vaccination. And that's just to make sure that the vaccine's effective and that those animals aren't going to then die from anthrax. So that's the most important thing, is the movement restrictions. And in Queensland, we have a range of legislative tools that we can use. In many cases, we don't need to use those tools, because if the producer is willing to undertake the required measures themselves, and I should point out that under the 2014 Biosecurity Act, all people have what we call a general biosecurity obligation to take all reasonable and practical measures not to spread a disease, a significant disease. And so a producer would have a general biosecurity obligation to ensure that he doesn't spread that disease off his property. And so therefore he would ensure that they hold those stock for that 20 days post-vaccination before those animals are sold or moved off that property. So that's the first thing, is the movement restriction. The second one is the vaccination of susceptible stock. And as I mentioned, the most effective way of preventing your stock from becoming ill is to vaccinate. And as I mentioned before, the vaccine takes around about 5 to 7 days, sometimes a bit longer, for immunity to develop. And then after that, those animals are safe to graze that country. As I mentioned before, we recommend that people with breeding animals vaccinate them twice at 6-month intervals to maintain that high level of immunity. And certainly the drug company recommends that you do it annually in highly contaminated or at-risk areas. And the final thing is to make sure that we try and remove as much contamination as possible, and we do that by destroying the carcasses by burning. Burning at the temperature of wood, which is around about 410 or 420 degrees centigrade, will totally destroy the spores. And so what we say that people do is don't move the carcass, because that might take the chance of contaminating more area or opening the carcass and exposing it to air. Is burn that carcass in situ if possible, and burn it down to ash, so there's nothing left, no hide, no hooves, no bones left. Burn it down to ash. And certainly in the responses we've done, that takes sometimes up to 3 days of continuous burning to get to that point. If you can't burn it because of fire risk or other conditions, or it's close to a structure, then you may have to move that animal, and then we recommend that it's buried deeply, at least 2 meters underground. But of course, you then have that ongoing risk of that carcass re-emerging somewhere in the future. So we definitely recommend that carcasses are destroyed by burning wherever possible. And then, of course, we've done other things. We've scraped out soil in yards and buried that. We've sprayed yards with formalin, which is a very nasty chemical and makes it quite uninhabitable for a while. But they're the sort of measures you need to do to decontaminate. Okay, so here we've got a couple of photos of that in progress. So we were lucky on most of the properties where we've responded to have a fair bit of pooled country. And so we were using front-end loaders and excavators to move that timber, pile it on top of the carcasses and burn them. So here we can see on the top left a carcass that is in the process of being burnt. And this was a couple of days later after it had been burnt down to ash. That was then scraped up and buried, deep buried, just to be sure. Any questions?
Yes, there are. I beg your pardon. One quick thing before we get into the questions is the ever-reliable Lawrence Gavey has provided me with information that he has confirmed the vaccine is not registered for use in goats. However, a veterinary prescription could be used to enable off-label use. So,
great. Well, thanks for clearing that up.
Yep, that's good. So another quick question that's come in. What is the mortality rate in cattle, sheep, and sheep versus pigs?
Hard to say, because it depends on how much exposure they get. But certainly if you get it's a bit counterintuitive, isn't it? If they get a lethal dose, they're going to die. So mortality rate can be very high, but it depends on which animals are exposed. And certainly in a herd, you may only have 1 or 2 animals exposed to the level to actually cause mortality. As an example, the latest herd we had 103 animals in it. Only 2 of those died, and they're all grazing the same area. But that was picked up quickly. So perhaps if those animals were left in that paddock for a longer period of time, maybe more of them would have died. So very hard to put a figure on mortality rate.
Okay. Another quick question. Is there a risk of spores being spread in floodwater?
Yes, there is. And we think that probably at least 3 of the 4 cases we've had, there was previous moderate rain in the area. And we think that that rain may wash the spores from an uncovered site some distance. And so, yes, it could. But of course, if you've got serious floodwater, it's also going to dilute the number of spores. So what you might find is that you may not get any immediate cases, but the spores may be spread to new country. And somewhere down the track, if that's suitable soil conditions, those bacteria may multiply in the soil and eventually cause another case.
Okay, thank you for that. Will spraying with formalin after burning help?
Yes, it will, absolutely. So formalin is one of the chemicals that will degrade the spores, but of course you then have to make sure that you've soaked all the contaminated area and all the contaminated material. And as I mentioned, formalin itself is quite a nasty chemical to operate with. You need PPE, you need to have P3 masks to protect yourself from the vapor. It's corrosive, it's carcinogenic, and it's a very nasty chemical. But yes, it does degrade the spores, and we have used it for that purpose.
Okay, one quick question before we I'm conscious of time. Can cats and dogs spread anthrax?
Unlikely. We do talk about whether it can be transmitted mechanically, but the amount that an animal would transmit mechanically is very little. We know that dogs and cats are highly resistant to the disease. That's not to say they don't die from anthrax, but it's quite rare. And in the scheme of things, I wouldn't be worried about dogs or cats. I would be more concerned about feral pigs and feral goats.
Okay.
But not
what about horses when you're mustering cattle?
Well, horses potentially can get anthrax and die from it. Again, you would be more concerned about the horse grazing. So if it's in a heavily contaminated paddock, there is a risk to the horse. But the movement of horses on the material on their feet is probably low likelihood, but you couldn't exclude it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all good. If you can continue, that'd be great.
Right, So that pretty well pulls me up at the end of my talk on anthrax. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the passive general surveillance program in Queensland, and that's where we provide a service to the community, to producers and to veterinarians to test material that may be suggestive of reportable diseases, and anthrax is certainly one of those. So people may be aware that we have a large laboratory situated in Brisbane, and that veterinary laboratory does a lot of disease investigation and diagnosis work. And so I'll just talk about that. So basically, it's important for us from a Queensland point of view to, we have a national responsibility to investigate and report on reportable diseases, nationally notifiable diseases. And we have a program where we take material submitted by Queensland Government Department, veterinarians and biosecurity officers, from private practitioners, and in some cases from general public, and we will look at those for to do a disease investigation, specifically looking for emergency diseases. So, of course, the big one that we're worried about is foot-and-mouth disease, and the reason that we want to do this investigation is that these sort of diseases are critical and have a major impact, would have a major impact on the livestock industry and all Australians. And the earlier you can detect these diseases, the better, so that we can try and contain them and stamp them out. And so a disease investigation program working through our laboratory is critical. And as a result of that, where appropriate samples are taken and submitted to the laboratory, particularly by private veterinarians and staff, there is no charge to the submitter for that testing to occur. Unfortunately, you still need to pay for the samples to be taken to the laboratory, but it's a system unlike some of the other states who do charge for each case, in general, we don't charge for the actual testing. So I just wanted to put that up so that people are aware that there is a government service to provide that diagnostic ability for practitioners in particular, so that we can be aware of incidents of significant diseases. Any questions?
Yes, we do. We have one final question, and I am very conscious of time. Can birds as scavengers act as a vector?
Potentially, yes, because they could potentially carry infectious material, but again, on the scheme of things, it would be a small amount. And so they would be far less important than something like feral pigs or feral goats who are actually able to become infected and then move through fences and then die, in adjoining properties. And we know that feral pigs can move significant distances, 50 to 100 kilometres in a night. So I think birds are much less of a risk than those other animals would be.
Okay, well, good. Thank you very much. I don't see any more questions coming in, so if you do have some questions, please quickly put it in. I don't think there is. No, there's not. So, Jonathan, you might like to explain what everyone's looking at.
Okay, I'll just put this slide up just to show that as part of our disease surveillance efforts, you sometimes find things that you weren't looking for. And this one is actually when I was working for the Commonwealth with the NARCS program in Cape York. We were doing significant disease investigations, shooting feral animals out of the helicopter and post-mortem them, looking for things like foot and mouth disease and classical swine fever and all those other significant diseases of livestock. But coincidentally, we're working on the west coast of Cape York, and a mate of mine was working with the ghost net and turtle program on the west coast there near Mapoon, and they had a problem with feral pigs digging up and eating turtle nests. And these pigs have got extremely good sense of smell. They're able to determine where a turtle nest is buried in the sand, and they will raid these, dig them up, and eat all the turtle eggs. They had particularly one problem in this area. They knew that there was this one boar that was a specialist in this, and they'd been trying to get him. They'd been using infrared sights. They'd been trying to use dogs. They'd had no luck whatsoever to catch this boar. And so this mate of mine rang me one day and said, look, while you're flying down there, can you just keep your eyes open for this particular pig? And so we went out early one morning and in the helicopter, and we're flying down the beach, and we saw him running off the beach. So he copped a lead pill in the back of the head. And then, as I always did, we post-mortem these animals just to see what they're eating. And lo and behold, this was the guy that was raiding the nests. And I think there's something like 37 flatback turtles in here. And they had obviously just emerged from the eggs and were just emerging out of the sand when this boar came and ate the lot. So after that, the predation on those turtle nests dropped to very low levels for at least for a few more months. So these pigs will eat anything. They'll eat you if you break your leg. So.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's amazing. That is just amazing.